Henry VIII is known as a horrifically brutal king, who ordered many executions during his reign as King of England, including the executions of 2 of his wives. These events have solidified Henry's place in history as a terrifying tyrant who was not a man you would have wanted to cross. The execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, shows the completely disgusting characteristics that plagued the king, with his own queen meeting a brutal end on Tower Green inside the Tower of London. What is worse is the fact there was little logic behind her execution, and also that the Queen of England was executed on trumped-up charges which were seemingly false and made up. Anne Boleyn's downfall is incredibly tragic and is surrounded in political manipulation, lies and a king's quest for a male heir. So join us today as we look at the brutal downfall and execution of Anne Boleyn, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. When Anne Boleyn became Henry VIII's second wife and queen, there was much uproar across England. The king's long marriage to Catherine of Aragon would come to an end at the expense of a younger woman, who could possibly provide the king with a son. Catherine and Henry's marriage only produced one child that survived, Mary, who would later go on to become Mary I or Bloody Mary. Henry, by the mid-1520s, was becoming very desperate for a legitimate son and heir to secure the Tudor dynasty and also succeed him as King of England. At the time it was unheard of for a queen to rule over England, so the quest for a legitimate son was imperative for the king. Henry originally may have tried to impress Anne to become his mistress, but Anne Boleyn in court was a woman of good morals. Despite Henry's advances, as he was still married, Anne would reject him and hold out, frustrating and keeping the king waiting until he had dealt with the issues surrounding his wife Catherine of Aragon. Henry and Anne exchanged love letters expressing their growing love, with Henry even saying how his heart belonged to only Anne. They often exchanged gifts, but this could do nothing to solve the huge problem of Henry's first marriage. During this time it was unheard of for anyone, let alone a king, to get a divorce. Catherine of Aragon was a proud, religious and powerful European regent, and she believed her marriage to Henry was sacred and immovable. The king, however, had different plans, as he dreamed of Anne Boleyn, and he wished to erase his long marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Henry began to search for a legal solution, even asking the Pope for a divorce or an annulment, saying that he himself had sinned in marrying his brother's widow. Some did believe this was a huge sin, but the Pope would not budge. The Pope forbade Henry to have a new marriage until the decision about Catherine of Aragon and him was made. Cardinal Thomas Wyatt was placed in charge of getting a solution and in getting the king his divorce. However, he failed to do this, and if Wolsey hadn't have tragically died, then it's possible that he may have even been executed himself for this failing. His career was destroyed by this, and the Pope continued to refuse to give Henry VIII what he wanted. In 1531, King Henry had enough. He took action into his own hands, banishing Catherine of Aragon from court, removing her from the royal chambers, and her rooms were then given to Anne Boleyn. The outrage across the country by this was riotous, as whilst Anne was eating once at Manor House, she was almost captured and seized by an angry mob of women. Even before marrying the king, Anne was given permission and the power to grant petitions and complete many of the roles and duties in which a Queen of England would do. Henry also granted her a peerage that made Anne incredibly rich and important even before she became queen. Her family also gained a significant degree of power in court and also were rewarded financially. Anne Boleyn was at the top. She was married to Henry VIII in a very secret ceremony on the 14th of November 1532. She became pregnant, and there would also later be a second wedding, but things in court began to move very quickly after this. A trial was held that decreed Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been a sin, and it was declared void. 5 days later, the marriage of the king and his new wife Anne Boleyn was declared sound and valid. Following this, Catherine of Aragon was then stripped of all her titles, including the queenship, and Anne Boleyn was then crowned Queen Consort on the 1st of June 1533. The ceremony held at Westminster Abbey was spectacular, and at the time Anne's pregnancy was clearly visible. There was much hope that the Queen would provide Henry with a son and a new heir to the throne. Anne had previously been paraded through the streets of London with much pomp and ceremony, but the public response to her wasn't overly positive. Following the marriage, the Pope announced that Henry would be excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and he greatly condemned the marriage to Anne Boleyn and was furious. The Pope himself even tried to cause more problems, declaring Henry and Catherine's marriage legal. The king then told all of his subjects to acknowledge the first act of succession, which formally recognised Anne Boleyn as queen, and also turned their back on the Pope's authority. Many influential people at court, including some of Henry's close friends such as Sir Thomas More and John Fisher, refused to accept this, and because of this they were later executed. It was decreed that Henry was the only supreme head of the Church of England, and the Church was now under his control and not the authority of Rome. The whole events of his marriage to Anne Boleyn had plunged England into religious turmoil. Anne herself had begun to acknowledge the Protestant faith and also promoted those who wanted to delve into this, and this also influenced the king's religious reforms. Following her coronation, Anne was preparing for the birth of the royal child. She settled down at Greenwich Palace, and the child that was born would later go on to become a queen and one of England's greatest. A daughter was born named Elizabeth, but the birth of a daughter was not what the king and queen wanted, as they deeply wished for a boy. Many astrologers and physicians had even predicted a son, and there was much disappointment that the royal couple had not produced a son. Although Elizabeth had a huge christening, Anne did worry about her older half-sister Mary posing a threat to her newborn daughter. Anne Boleyn as queen had a huge amount of staff and servants that served her and her adjutants. There were over 250 who performed a number of different roles, and she even had more than 60 maids of honour. The king and queen's relationship at first was very happy, and Anne was known to be an intelligent member of the royal household. She oversaw court and spent huge sums of money on jewels, decorations, and many other luxuries, including renovating a number of different palaces. However, her downfall would come in the same sense as Henry's previous wife, Catherine of Aragon, with the king's quest for a son being her hamartia. Following a miscarriage in Christmas 1534, Henry was even discussing with Thomas Cranmer and Cromwell the possibility of divorcing Anne, but nothing came of it at this time. She later fell pregnant again, but was subject to much gossip and hatred in court, being referred to as the king's whore by some, and public opinion began to turn against her further. Henry would really show his brutality and character when it came to Anne's downfall. Her struggles to provide Henry with a son, ultimately through no fault of her own, plagued her in the king's eyes. Catherine of Aragon's death in January 1536 was greeted by Anne and the king with celebration in rather poor taste. Following this, Anne became pregnant yet again, and in her mind she must have realised that failure to provide a son to Henry could place her in immediate danger, with the king growing tired. As Catherine had died, in the eyes of the Catholic faith especially, Henry would now be free to marry without any question of legality, as he could be considered to be a widow. It was around this time that Henry's famous wandering eye kicked in, as his attention shifted towards another lady at court, Jane Seymour, and he gifted her a locket with a small portrait of the king and Jane inside. Whilst being near Anne, Jane kept opening and closing this, and Anne reacted by ripping the locket off, so hard that her fingers were cut open. Near to this time, the king was also involved in a famous accident at a tournament in which he was knocked out for 2 hours, and 5 days after this, Anne miscarried her child, with the worry of the king's health being the primary blame. It's also been acknowledged that a possible cause of this tragedy was the fact that Anne entered a room and saw Jane Seymour sitting on her husband, the king's lap, and flew off in a blind fit of rage. According to Imperial Advisor to the Holy Roman Empire, Eustace Chapuis, the loss of the child and pregnancy was the start of the end of the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Henry was completely obsessed with this drive for a male heir, and the miscarriages Anne faced caused him great anger. He grew incredibly tired of Anne for this, and even declared that he had been forced into marriage by Anne's spells and deception, and following her final miscarriage, Anne Boleyn was forced out of the royal apartments. Jane Seymour, Henry's new mistress, was then moved in, and this caused Anne great pain, and her downfall began. Her downfall, it's believed, was plotted by her former friend and close ally of the king, Thomas Cromwell. Anne had become a major threat to Cromwell, and she had previously argued with him about issues over where the church finances were going and also foreign policy. Cromwell favoured making the king richer, and for this gained much favour with Henry. Cromwell probably played on the king's wavering confidence in his queen to help bolster his own power, and with Anne out of the picture, Cromwell could gain even more power and influence. Cromwell himself only became involved in marital problems between Henry and Anne when the king ordered him to, but soon accusations were levelled against Anne Boleyn. She was accused of adultery, incest and treason. Cromwell, being a man of immense cunning and intelligence, used all of his experience in Tudor politics to target parts of Anne's personality and court. He closely monitored and interrogated those who were on the periphery of Anne's circle to see what he could obtain. Cromwell and his allies devised this case against the Queen to remove her from power, and as a result, the subsequent trial was a legal joke. A number of men were arrested and accused of different activities with the Queen. Mark Smeaton, a Flemish musician who played for the Queen, was arrested and initially denied being the Queen's lover, but later confessed under torture. Another member of her court, Henry Norris, was arrested, but because of his high status he could not be tortured. Norris denied any guilt, swearing that the Queen was innocent, but evidence was produced against Norris, saying that Anne had accused him of coming into her chambers to pay attention to her and not her ladies-in-waiting. Later, Sir Francis Weston was also arrested, along with Sir William Brereton, and these were all accused of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. More men were arrested, including Sir Thomas Wyatt and Sir Richard Page, who were acquitted of all charges after further investigation turned up nothing. The final man accused was the most shocking, Anne's own brother George Boleyn, who was arrested on charges of incest and treason, being accused of 2 incidents of incest. The accusations against these men were ludicrous and false, with the main aim to convict Anne Boleyn and frame these other men along with her. For these accusations, on the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and then taken to the Tower of London by barge. Upon arriving at the notorious prison, she broke down, asking for her father and also her brother. 4 of the men who were accused were tried in Westminster on the 12th of May 1536. 3 days later, Anne and her brother were tried inside the Tower of London before a jury of 27 peers. Accused of adultery, incest and treason, the charges against the Queen of England were incredibly shocking. All of the accused, the men and even Queen Anne Boleyn, were found guilty and were sentenced to death. The trial was a complete sham, based on nothing but falsities and manufactured evidence, and the downfall of Anne Boleyn was nearly complete, which even her greatest enemies would have been shocked at. The men accused were executed on the 17th of May 1536 on Tower Hill, and following this, it was reported inside the tower that Anne was rather happy and seemed to have accepted her fate, being prepared to die. Anne's sentence for treason could have seen her being burned alive, but the king commuted her sentence to a simpler beheading, but rather than have his queen die by a commoner's axe, he paid for an expert swordsman to be brought in from France to perform the execution. On the day of her execution, William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, wrote, "This morning she sent for me, that I might be with her at such a time as she received the good Lord, to the intent I should hear her speak as touching her innocency, always to be clear." He later went on to say that Anne said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," and then she put her hands about it, laughing heartily. "I have seen so many men, and also women, executed, and that they have been in great sorry, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy in her death." So Anne seemed in a relaxed state at the Tower, but for many people her death caused great upset and misery. Shortly before dawn on the 19th of May 1536, she called the Constable of the Tower to once again receive her Mass, and she prayed of her eternal salvation of her soul, and said she had never once been unfaithful to Henry. She then received the sacrament. Kingston came then later to tell her to make herself ready, as her executioner was waiting for her. Anne, as she left the apartment inside the Tower, was surrounded by 4 servants, and she followed William Kingston to the scaffold at 9 o'clock. She wore a red petticoat and was accompanied also by 2 female attendants making her final walk from the Queen's house, where she was staying, to the scaffold. Her happiness was noted by onlookers, and then she arrived at the scaffold, climbed up, and made a short speech. Anne Boleyn was spared the public execution on Tower Hill, and was gifted a private execution inside the Tower of London. However, there was still a large number of people who were here to witness the beheading of a queen. She spoke to the crowd, saying, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. He was ever a good and gentle and sovereign Lord. This I take my leave of the world, and of you all. I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." It was noted how the delivery of her speech had a profound effect on some. Her voice sometimes wavered in weakness, and she spoke gracefully, and Anne even reduced a number of spectators to tears. Anne Boleyn's ladies then helped her prepare for her executioner and the sword, and she thanked each of them for their loyal service to her, and told them to pray for her soul. The executioner then asked for his forgiveness, and she granted this, handing him a sack of coins for his payment. One of her ladies then allegedly placed a blindfold over her eyes. She was then asked to kneel, and Anne said her final prayers. It was also noted how she appeared dazed as she knelt down on her knees into the straw, and she faced the crowd repeating, "O Christ, receive my spirit." It was also said how she did display some fear. The ladies in waiting began to erupt in an outcry of tears and emotion as they knelt at the back of the scaffold, waiting for the end of their mistress. As Anne quickly knelt into the straw, she faced her final seconds. After saying a few more quiet prayers, the executioner unleashed his sword from underneath a lump of straw, and in one swift blow, the executioner did his job. In one quick stroke of a sword, a Queen of England, whose downfall had been expertly and brutally manufactured, lost her life. Anne Boleyn's head fell into the straw, and when it fell, it was covered in a white handkerchief, with cannons lining Tower Wharf then being fired to tell the world of Anne's death. Her execution had been witnessed by a number of prominent members of court, including Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, but also Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall himself. Her head and body were then taken by the ladies, despite their emotion, and they deemed it their duty to themselves help dispose of Anne's body, as they didn't want it to be handled by unworthy men. Her head and body were then placed into an arrow chest and taken into the chapel at the Tower for burial, and she was buried inside the Chapel St Peter ad Vincula within the walls of the Tower. Anne Boleyn's downfall and execution was incredibly swift and sad, being manufactured by Cromwell at the behest of King Henry VIII. Although she rose to prominence under rather debatable circumstances, when she did start to impress the king, she was a woman of morals, refusing to become his mistress whilst the king was already married. It's a downfall that's linked to failed pregnancies, the inability to produce the son that Henry desperately wanted, and also one that is tinged in political manipulations and betterment at court and in the king's eyes. Anne Boleyn today is remembered as Henry VIII's tragic second wife, and as a woman who was wronged in the eyes of so many. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.